my presentation this evening is going to be strangely titled. It's Romancing Uganda. And the reason I have titled it Romancing Uganda is it was an anniversary adventure. So that's a photograph of myself with a lot of hair, and a photograph of my beautiful bride, Jeannie, and our two flower girls, who are both young women and have grown up to get married and have children. So it really makes me feel very old looking at that photograph. That was 21 years ago and a half. And we got married on a farm in Plettenberg Bay, the farm that Jeannie grew up on. So that was 20 years ago. And then that was 1 year ago. So that was exactly a year later. And we decided to do an anniversary adventure to Uganda. So I said we decided to do an anniversary adventure to Uganda, and that really is not strictly speaking true. So what actually happened is I decided I really wanted to go to Uganda. There are tons of reasons, and I'll come to them now. And I said to Jeannie, let's go to Uganda and celebrate our 20th anniversary. It'll be very romantic. It'll be beautiful sunsets, beautiful drinks on the shores of Lake Victoria, and you'll have a grand time sipping gin and tonics. It's really the perfect place for gin and tonics. And she remarkably agreed to that. So we put some plans in place, and we took a gap to coincide with our actual anniversary. And as it turned out, we did the actual guerrilla trekking on the 6th of March, which was our anniversary. So there was a suggestion made by my colleagues at the Bird Club that Jeannie join me for presenting this talk, but I suspect that you would have heard a lot more of the truth if Jeannie had been here, because I have a tendency to exaggerate a little bit. All right, so why Uganda? So what was the reason we would be going to Uganda? And I think if there are a lot of birders in the audience, you'll all look at this and say, well, why not Uganda? Because it really is an incredible place. But for those of you that don't know Uganda that well, let's talk a little bit about it. So that's where Uganda sits in Africa. It's part of the East African countries. It lies just to the west of Kenya and to the east of the Congo, and it nestles down together with Rwanda and Burundi, and it shares the shores of Lake Victoria with Kenya and Tanzania. So Lake Victoria is the largest lake in Africa. It looks tiny in that left-hand map, but it really is quite a remarkable piece of water. So here's the first reason. It's pretty easy to access Uganda from South Africa. So it's a quick flight to Joburg and then about a 4-hour flight from Johannesburg to Entebbe. And the airport you land in is at Entebbe International Airport, which is about 50 kilometers from Kampala. And by all accounts, Entebbe is the place you want to go, because Kampala is a much busier and a much less attractive city. So another good reason is safe and easy travel. So I've taken a few photographs. These are actually Jeannie's photos, because she had a lot more interest in photographing the transport mechanisms than the birds. And I had very little interest in photographing transport mechanisms. So I took lots of pictures of birds and not too many pictures of taxis. So these are taxis, and people go in taxis to get around, but the most common form of travel in Uganda is something called a border. So those who haven't traveled in Africa won't know what a border is, but I'm going to show you a few photos of a border. This is not a border, this is a bicycle with this guy's entire wares on his bicycle, and he'll be selling those. That's a view from behind. There's slip-slops, there's soccer balls, there's a whole bunch of clothes, and I suspect he was on his way to a market. And then this guy was riding his bicycle to deliver his bread. And here we see a border on the right-hand side, and essentially a border is a Chinese motorbike, and they are unbelievably resilient, and they're used for any number of people, produce, live produce, we'll come to that, but a lot of borders carry bananas. So you can carry a bed on a border, and this guy was on his way. It looks like a brand new bed with the wrapping still on it. You can carry a sack of meal, but this was our firm favorite for the reasons that you would have a border. So it's not the greatest photo, because Jeannie had to react very quickly as this guy went past. Those two pinkish items on the back of that border are pigs. And not only are they pigs, but they're live pigs. And Jeannie has a wonderful way of describing what happened every time this motorbike went over a little speed bump. Every time it went over a speed bump, the pigs would let out a little squeal. So it was almost like the suspension of the border was letting out the squeal, but it was actually the pigs. So anyway, that's the transport in Uganda, and we didn't have to go on a border to get around to different places. We were very lucky to be in a nice 4x4 Land Rover, and we were driven around by our guide. Another good reason to go to Uganda is the people are unbelievably friendly. This photo of me on the left is at the Entebbe Botanical Gardens, and this little threesome of these wonderful kids on a Sunday afternoon spotted me with my camera and came up and chatted to me, and it was quite an amazing experience to be. The guy in the middle doesn't look that happy. I think he's worried that Jeannie's going to probably steal him, because she threatened to steal quite a lot of Ugandan children. And then here's another indication of some kids that Jeannie was prepared to steal. This was at the Bwindi Swamp. All right, another great reason to go to Uganda was for the food. So we stayed in some wonderful lodges, and we had mostly Western food, but we went to a place near Bwindi called Kazinga Channel. It's a traditional eating house, and it's definitely part of everyone's tourist destination when you go into the western part of Uganda. If you are in that part of the world and you're near Kibale, Kazinga Channel, you get served these amazing meals, very traditional. And that was the food that we had on the left-hand side. And then I wasn't going to turn down an ice-cold chocolate milkshake on a very hot Ugandan day. And then most importantly for Jeannie, I think this was her best part of Uganda, was discovering that they actually make incredibly good gin. So this Uganda Waraji gin is the local gin, and it comes in a few different flavors, but Jeannie prefers the very traditional London dry. So she bought, I think, countless bottles. I think she's holding them up in the airport there. And I think that was only a fraction of the number of bottles that she managed to cram into her bag. And quite interestingly, they make a lot of gin by the side of the roads. So we saw quite a few very informal gin distilleries. And it was basically some lady sitting next to a river, and they'd have a whole bunch of contraptions which would filter and ferment banana leaves and all sorts of different things that would then ferment into alcohol, and it creates this clear liquid which they call the gin, and it was about 80% proof. So definitely not something you want to be drinking too much of. And then abundant wildlife. I mean, it's East Africa. It's right next door to Kenya, which is very well known for its wildlife, and we saw tons of animals. These are called Ugandan cobs, and we saw tons of those at Ishasha. These are the world famous tree climbing lions at Ishasha. And they have this habit of climbing these big trees and sitting them and looking very lazy, other than sitting in bushes. Spotted hyena, and obviously a Nile crocodile. Then there's no shortage of scenic beauty. This is a wonderful woodland scene at Ishasha National Park with some storm clouds in the distance. And this is where we spent most of our time, in the high altitude forests of Mbwindi and Kibale. And I'll show you where we went in a second. There were, of course, many, many beautiful birds. I swindled Jeannie into coming with me on this trip. I sold it as a guerrilla tracking experience, and a bit of savanna and forests and wonderful lodges and gin and tonics. But I knew that I would see a ton of amazing birds. This is a great blue churaco. It's an enormous churaco. I think it's the largest of its family. Churacos are obviously endemic to Africa. And this is definitely one of the most gaudy or audacious ones. They don't call it the lipstick birds for nothing. So we saw lots of great blue churacos, which was amazing. But the main reason we went to Uganda, and I've made reference to it many times over already, was for the gorillas. So I hate spoiling good stories that come later on in the presentation, but I needed to tell you why we went to Uganda in the first place. And this was a wonderful male silverback that we were lucky enough to see, and I'll get to that in a sec. So where did we go? So taking that map of Uganda on the left-hand side, and then we can cut it into a bit of a quarter. We spent most of our time in the southwestern part of Uganda. We flew into the beautiful town of Entebbe, and you can see Kampala lies a little bit north of Lake Victoria. And from Entebbe, we accessed western Uganda. So this is where we went. We started in the Entebbe Botanical Gardens. We flew on a wonderful little Cessna to Bwindi. We then went to Queen Elizabeth National Park, the Ishasha section, which is kind of like going to a Savannah, Kruger Park type of thing. We then went to the Kazinga Channel, which was amazing for photography and game viewing. We then headed up to Kibale, which is where the chimpanzees are, and it's another beautiful high altitude forest. And then we finished our time at the Mabamba Swamp before coming back to Entebbe. So landing in Entebbe is quite an experience. You fly over the lake, and Entebbe is very much a garden city, I would describe it as. And there's no better example of that than the Entebbe Botanical Gardens. And I remember we landed and we sat, well, we stood in customs. What they do is you pre-buy your visa. And then when you get to the front of the counter, they actually print every single visa for every passenger. And then they cut it with a pair of scissors and then they stick it into your passport. So we were right at the back of the queue, and an Ethiopian Airlines flight had landed just before us. And we spent a hell of a lot of time in the arrivals hall. So Entebbe, the first time I heard the name Entebbe was in relation to the movie Raid on Entebbe. And I certainly wasn't old. I'm certainly not old enough to have seen the movie, Charles Bronson looking very young there. But we did some research, and I was very interested in the whole story behind the raid on Entebbe. So essentially, if you look on this map on the left, an Air France flight left Tel Aviv, heading for Paris, with a stop in Athens. It stopped in Athens, and then shortly after leaving Athens, it was hijacked by 5 Palestinian hijackers. They redirected the flight to this town of Benghazi in Libya, where they had a friendly way to refuel. And then Idi Amin, being Palestinian friendly, he invited the plane to land in Entebbe, where he would host the plane and the hostages. So the hostages were taken, you can see in this map on the right-hand side. This is the new terminal, which was where we landed. But the old terminal, and you can actually see the old terminal from the new terminal as you're leaving the airport. And you can actually even see the plane. It still sits on the runway, I think almost as a museum item. And the plane was redirected and landed in Entebbe and went into, the passengers were taken out of the plane and put into the old terminal. And what they did is they separated the Israelis, and there were Jewish and non-Jewish Israelis, from the rest of the passengers. And ultimately they released all the non-Israeli passengers quite quickly. But 106 hostages remained in that building, and they sat there for 6 or 7 days. And the reason the hijacking took place was that the Palestinians wanted to exchange the hostages for 41 Palestinian prisoners in Israel. So it became Israel's problem, and the Mossad got together and put together a team, and they flew into Entebbe and landed on the strip a long way away. You can see the direction of their flight over here, this dotted line, and they essentially then stormed the building. And some of the information is fascinating, because there were 106 hostages and 5 hijackers. All hijackers were killed. Of the Israeli soldiers, there was one Israeli soldier that died, and his name was Jonathan Netanyahu, and he was the brother of Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu, who is the current Prime Minister of Israel. And of the hostages, there were 4 deaths amongst the hostages. 3 of them died in the raid, but the most bizarre death was an elderly lady who, while imprisoned in the building, the terminal building, she was eating a meal and she started choking on a chicken bone. So they rushed her off to hospital. They took her out of the terminal building and she went to a hospital. And when the raid was over and the hostages were all freed, Idi Amin ordered for her to be killed as retribution for the fact that many of his soldiers and the hijackers had been killed. So they walked into the hospital, Idi Amin's soldiers, and they killed nurses and doctors, as well as this elderly Jewish lady who had been choking on a chicken bone. So it's a really bizarre story and quite fascinating, and has absolutely nothing to do with birds or gorillas. Anyway, that's a slightly more pleasant photo of us standing on the shores of Lake Victoria, enjoying our beers. And we were able to get through customs and arrive very happily at Entebbe Botanical Gardens. Jeannie went for a run, and I took my camera and I started walking around the gardens taking some photos. So there's going to be tons of bird photos, and I'm going to spin through them quite quickly. I was seeing lifers left, right, and center. These 3 birds were all lifers for me. Grey-capped warbler, the golden-backed weaver, and this beautiful yellow-crowned woodpecker. The black and white cast hornbill. Unfortunately, this is a photo of the female. The male is a far more impressive bird with a much larger casque on top of its bill. Red-chested sunbird, and it was wonderful to see African grey parrots flying around freely instead of seeing them in cages, which we so often do in South Africa. And then we had this beautiful African wood owl during the day. There were lots of birds mobbing it, and it was quite easy to pick up, and it posed so nicely for a pic. All right, so we spent a night in Entebbe at a wonderful guest house, and then we started the real part of our trip, and that was heading to the southwest to Bwindi Impenetrable Forest. And I just loved the name. From when I first heard the name of the forest, I just loved the fact that it was called Bwindi Impenetrable Forest. And it's a nature reserve that lies in the southwest corner. So to get there, you can either drive for about 6 hours, or you can take this small little aeroplane. That's Jeannie cuddling up next to one of the other tourists, and unfortunately too close, I think. And what we did is we flew from Entebbe. We landed at a place called Kashishi, and that was on a grass runway, and that's a plane on the grass runway. Then we took off from there. We dropped off a few passengers. We flew to this amazing, very high altitude runway that apparently they close because the weather is often very bad there, but it was quite clear on our day. You land at this very high altitude, and the plane sometimes battles to take off. So it was quite a hairy takeoff again. And then we flew right back over Bwindi, and we landed on a wonderful gravel runway where we were picked up by our guide, who's this man over here, standing next to the yellow vehicle that we traveled in. His name is Steffi, and we also were treated to Fred, who is a local bird guide, and he traveled around with us for the entire duration as well. So Bwindi has got 3 main sections that we concentrated on. It's got Buhoma, which is where we stayed. There's lots of hotels, and there's a little town called Buhoma. And incidentally, it's the place where there were bandits from the Congo who came into Uganda and basically took British tourists as hostages and took them into the Congo. So also another very sad part of Ugandan's tourism history. Then there's the neck, which is a very famous area for a particular bird. And then Ruhija is another part of Bwindi where you go to see particularly special birds. So we took a car trip from Buhoma to Ruhija through the neck in order to see a bunch of wonderful birds. That's the entrance to the park. And that is the amazing sanctuary gorilla forest camp that we stayed in. So every evening we'd sit on those wooden chairs and enjoy a wonderful drink before heading off for a meal. And Jeannie decided to go for a run again. And not surprisingly, I decided to go and take some more pictures. So some of the birds of Bwindi, this is a grey kestrel that was feeding on a rather unfortunate item of prey. Just a beautiful birds. We saw not that many of them, but it's a bird we really battled to see in Southern Africa. And then I think the most important thing to talk about in terms of birds in the southwest of Uganda is that it's part of the Albertine Rift. So the Albertine Rift is the western arc of the eastern Rift Valley in Africa. And it has a very high degree of endemism and biodiversity. So there are 41 species of birds that are endemic, but they tend to spread over 6 countries. So that's Zambia, Tanzania, Burundi, Rwanda, Uganda, and the DRC. So the Albertine Rift spreads from the south of Lake Tanganyika and all the way through to the north of Lake Albert. And we targeted certain endemics amongst many other birds. This is a Kiwi ground thrush, which is one of those endemics. And then just a few pictures of some of the beautiful birds. This is not an endemic, but it's quite spectacular despite it sitting on a rather unpleasant wire, telephone wire. And then another set of pictures of great blue turaco. This Luda's bushshrike, a very vocal and wonderful bird. Brown-capped weaver, certainly a lot more attractive than a lot of the weavers we see in South Africa, and yellow-billed barbet, which is a quite extraordinary barbet. It's an enormous barbet. It's probably 1.5 times the size of a crested barbet, and it's got this beautiful bright orange bill and yellow facial circle. And then familiar red-chested cuckoo, and these wonderful male and female African shrike flycatchers, which are closely related to the black and white shrike flycatcher that you'll find in Mozambique. And then buff-throated apellus and a wonderfully confiding equatorial acolyte, which is a type of robin. these slightly grayer forest birds, dusky blue flycatcher and grey-throated tit flycatcher, and then the awful family of birds in Africa, the greenbuis. So I think we saw about 15 species of greenbuis on the trip. And I remember standing at one section of forest with Fred. Jeannie was either going for a run or having an afternoon sleep. And we had a little bird party, and I think we saw probably 6 species of greenbuis. And I'm going to admit that I ticked all of them, but I can tell you for fact that I wouldn't have been able to tell one single one apart from the others. The ones that I've displayed here are actually the identifiable ones. I came back with tons of pictures of greenbuis that I certainly couldn't identify after the fact. Things like Xavier's and Cabanis's and Shelley's greenbuis. They really are they're very tricky, and I didn't enjoy them too much, except the ones that are quite attractive, like the red-tailed greenbuis. Right, so we took a drive to Ruhija. We went over the neck, bounced around in the vehicle, and we accessed the forest. You travel down a path through the forest and you see birds as you go. And our ultimate destination was one of the swamps that occur at the lower altitudes amongst all the tall trees, as there were some special birds that we were looking for there. Everywhere you go in the Ugandan wildlife reserves, you have to be accompanied by a Ugandan wildlife official with a rifle. And they tell you that it's because of the forest elephants and they need to protect you from forest elephants. But I suspect, given the hijacking that took place, I think in the early 90s, I think they want to make sure that tourism is well looked after. And I think these guys come with us to protect us from anything that might happen, because you're very close to the DRC border. So we had wonderful guys following us. They essentially walk about 10 meters in front of the group and 10 meters behind, and they just stroll along. Sometimes they're interested in the birds we're looking at, and I think sometimes they just shake their heads. And then we got local guides wherever we went. So we had Fred, who was very knowledgeable, but this guy standing next to Fred, I can't remember his name, he was incredibly knowledgeable as well. So those are the beautiful trees of Bwindi Impenetrable Forest. You wind your way through and you pick up some incredible birds. The bar-tailed trogon, very closely related to our Narina trogon, and these dusky long-tailed cuckoos, which when I first saw one, I actually went completely nuts, because the other long-tailed cuckoo we get here in Southern Africa, barred long-tailed cuckoo, is a really special bird. But as it turns out, these dusky long-tailed cuckoos call all the time, and we saw plenty of them. So a really pretty bird. The banded prinia, very attractive, striking prinia. And here's one of the Albertine Rift endemics, this spectacular purple-breasted sunbird. I've put an E where the birds are endemic to the Albertine Rift. There's a mountain greenbull and this yellow-eyed black flycatcher, and this mountain master aplis, also an endemic on the walk that we did in Ruhija. So this little swamp is at the bottom of a long winding pass that we went through the forest, and we got to the swamp and we stood there and we were looking for a grouse rush warbler. They are absolutely restricted to these little swamps amongst the forests and the trees, and we were very lucky to see one. Fred says that they can be very tough. And just standing where Fred is standing there were billions of mosquitoes, for starters, but we saw 4 endemic Albertine Rift endemics at that very spot. So dusky crimson wing, we saw a bird called a strange weaver, this grouse rush warbler, and the purple-breasted sunbird. So the bird we wanted to see most, and Jeannie is looking not at the bird, but looking at me, often playing the fool, but she did look at a few of the birds, was this African green broadbill. So this is one of the top birds of Africa, and it is actually not related to the African broadbills. So our African broadbill, or rufous-sided broadbill, I think it's called, are the African broadbills. This is related more closely to the Asian broadbills. And it's an incredibly difficult bird to see. Very, very excellent, high-pitched call that's quite tricky to pick up. And without a guide, you've got virtually no chance. And when you do see them, you're just grateful that you see them and you don't worry too much about what the photo looks like. It's got this wonderful lime green coloring with a blue throat. And the picture doesn't do it any justice, but there was a lot of excitement when we saw that one. Then we got back in the car and we headed back over the neck. And this time it wasn't pitch dark. So we got out of the car and we started looking for some birds. It's basically a river crossing at the top of a pass. And there's these wonderful shining blue kingfishers, which look a lot like our half-collared kingfishers. and we saw that, but there was one bird that we had to see at the neck, and that was this bird called the black bee eater. So this is the bird to see at the neck in Bwindi, and you can see why. It's got this wonderful red throat and these beautiful electric blue streaks on its black chest. So we battled for about 20 minutes, and I was starting to panic because you can't go to the neck and not see a black bee eater. But eventually we had this bird sitting so nicely, and just a wonderful experience. Okay, so now for those that want a bit of a break from the birds, we're going to go into some gorilla tracking, which was the main reason for our trip in the first place. And this was our entourage that we trekked with. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 tourists, and the rest of the people are part of the whole process. This was, in fact, the guide was a wonderful lady, Goran. She was taking the photograph. But you have the Ugandan wildlife sort of officials. They carry the rifles, and then you take these porters. So these guys over here are porters, and what they do is they carry your bags, because why should you carry your bag? It would be silly for you to come all this way to Uganda and then have to carry your bag through the forest. But it does feel good letting someone carry your bag, because this is the employment that they get. They come from the surrounding villages, and I think it's good for them to have the work there, because there's not much else. So this was our party that was heading off to go gorilla tracking. And what you do is you gather in the morning at 8 o'clock and you get a briefing. You get told where you're going to go. And what they do is they allocate each group to the relative effort that they think that the gorillas are going to take to see. And some people will probably think it's a bit canned, but it really isn't. I think they have a very high success rate of seeing and finding the gorillas, but it's not a canned experience. And the reason I say that is because you can trek for 8 hours in a day before you find them. We were very lucky. It took us only about half an hour to find a family group. And what they do is at Buhoma, where we were, there are 4 family groups of gorillas, and they send 4 different groups to 4 different gorilla groups. So ours required an hour and a half in the car to get to a place very close to where the neck is. And then we got out of the car and we kept in walkie-talkie contact with the trackers. So what happens is you have 3 or 4 trackers that are allocated to every gorilla group in the forest, and they spend their entire day with the gorillas. They follow them, they watch them eat, they watch them feed, and then at about 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening, when the gorillas settle down to sleep, wherever they are, the guides head back to whatever accommodation is close by. Often it's just a little shack. They sleep the night there, and then at 7 o'clock in the morning, they go back to where they left them, and then they start tracking them. So they see where the gorillas have moved, and they're big animals, so it's easy to see where they've been. And they follow the gorillas until they find them, and when they find them, they walkie-talkie the tourist guides, and they say the gorillas are in XYZ place, and all forest trails will eventually lead to where the gorillas are. Sometimes the trackers battle to find them, and that's why you might wander around for 7 or 8 hours. And then sometimes the trackers find them very quickly. In fact, in our case, when we were in contact with the trackers, they hadn't found them yet. And we actually found the gorillas before the trackers did. So once again, Jeannie, well kitted. We spoke a lot about her khaki attire. She had swapped her pink running top for some very appropriate khaki attire. In fact, the photo on the right was actually the Ruhija walk, but she was holding the spear that one of the guides had, and then she was fondling some AK-47s. So I'm not quite sure what that means. Anyway, you head off with your group, and we walked through this weird pine forest, which is an alien forest on the edge of the main indigenous forest, and you walk until our guide spotted a silverback in the path in front of us. So this is one of the tourists on the right-hand side, one of the ladies that was with us. And this little black blob over here is one of the gorillas. And this was the secondary silverback. You can see he's got a nice silverback over here. And there's all these, it could take me 3 hours to describe the family dynamics of these gorilla groups. There will always be one dominant silverback, and he is the only male that mates with probably 5 or 6 females. So the secondary silverback does not mate at all. Sometimes there's a little bit of a tryst, and either the secondary male takes over from the dominant male, or the secondary male gets chased out by the dominant male. And what often happens is the dominant males get older and ultimately get overtaken by the younger males that are a bit stronger, and you get these solitary males that wander the forest on their own and don't have a family that are associated with them. This secondary male was suitably well behaved, and he was allowed to stay in the group. But it's just the most phenomenal experience sitting. They say 7 meters is your distance you got to keep, but there's nothing you can do when the gorilla comes close to you. So we had many occasions where the big male gorillas, they kind of sat lazily, but we had females that walked right amongst our feet. And this is this little video clip. It's very short, but this is the kind of thing that happens as you walking through the forest. This is a female with a baby on its back, and it literally rubbed past Jean's legs, and then it wanders down amongst the ferns. So quite a bizarre experience. And when we found the gorillas, they weren't feeding yet. And what they do is they leave their sleeping place and they wander the forest, and then they start moving quite quickly to feed. And what that means is you have to follow them quickly. So this photograph of Jeannie and some of the other tourists walking down a slope doesn't look that bad, but it was basically sliding down on your bum. And the gorillas move very quickly, and you don't want to waste any of your hour that you get with them trying to relocate them. So we were running through the forest and sliding down on our bums through this very steep slope. And then we eventually found them sitting in this clearing in the forest, and we enjoyed some amazing photographic opportunities. This is the dominant male silverback sitting in the bush, and what could be better than an anniversary photo of Jeannie and I with a big silverback gorilla sitting in the background. Just incidentally, this lady over here was one of the ladies on the group with us, and I could swear it was Meghan Markle. And I kept on telling Jeannie that Meghan Markle was in the group with us, but it turned out it wasn't Meghan Markle, but sure, she was a serious lookalike. And while I, even on our anniversary day, was admiring the looks of the Meghan Markle lookalike, Jeannie was at least enjoying the looks of her husband that was with us. So I think that was actually fair. Right, so we have this beautiful, well, he's not so beautiful. You can see those old eyes. This is the dominant male silverback. He definitely was getting a little bit old, but still dominant. This was the secondary male enjoying some food. And what they do is they basically sit amongst the plants and just grab leaves from everywhere and just stuff them into the mouths and basically strip off the leaves. This was a very young animal. I think probably just a teenager, having a good scratch. And then this is how they strip the branches. They put the branch in their mouth and then just pull it, and all the leaves and all the juicy stuff comes off as they sit. So we spent our wonderful hour with these gorillas, and it really was an hour of my life that I don't think I've had a better wildlife experience in that. It was just absolutely phenomenal. And if I can recommend you do anything in your life from a wildlife perspective, it's seeing these gorillas in Mbwindi. And while we were in this sort of forest clearing with a lot of these plants, we at least got one of the Albertine Rift endemics. There's a bird called the handsome francolin. So while everyone was enjoying the gorillas, a covey of handsome francolins flushed from underneath one of the gorillas and flew across the clearing, and I was doubly happy with my hour's experience. All right, so we had to leave Bwindi at some point, and Bwindi's at about 2,000 or 2,500 meters altitude. Very nice and cool and beautiful. And then we headed to Ishasha Wilderness Camp. This is a Bodouin's snake eagle, which is very similar to our black-chested snake eagle, very closely related. And Ishasha is a little bit north of Bwindi, and I'm showing a red line there. We didn't fly there. We got into our yellow Land Rover, and we headed north into what's called Queen Elizabeth National Park, the Ishasha section, and there's a wonderful lodge called the Ishasha Wilderness Camp. So this is where we stayed, the red circle. This is the main road going north. This is the DRC border. And this is the Ishasha River that flows and makes up the borderline for a large part of it. Wonderful savanna scenery, and that's the entrance to our lodge. I've included this picture for a specific reason. This is the Ishasha River, and I took a trip with Steffi and Fred one afternoon while Jeannie relaxed. I wanted to get to the DRC border, and I wanted to see what birds there were. Obviously much warmer, much lower altitude, lazy river flowing downstream. And this is the exact spot that an American tourist was kidnapped 2 weeks after we were there. So it's quite bizarre. There was that kidnapping sort of in the early 90s, which was very much a violent kidnapping. This woman, I think it was, she was eventually released when a ransom was paid, and I think it was really a financial hijacking or kidnapping. But it's just bizarre. We were there feeling as safe as you could possibly feel, and 2 weeks later, this lady was kidnapped from here. Right, some of the wonderful birds, they're more savanna type birds, grey-headed kingfisher. We get grey-headed kingfishers in South Africa, so nothing particularly new there, and it's brown-eared woodpecker. And I will say, those that know me know that woodpeckers are my favorite bird family, so anytime there's a woodpecker to see, I had to get a photograph of it. Here's this wonderful black-bellied bustard that was displaying. It's got the most wonderful display. It makes this weird popping sound as it opens its beak like that, and we watched this particular male display for about half an hour. Ross's Churaco, another one of the absolutely spectacular Churacos that you get in Uganda, and quite different to a lot of the other Churacos that we're familiar with that are mostly green. This one's this violet color with this red crest. And then Senegal lapwing, another beautiful woodpecker, and the yellow-throated longclaw. And I think my favorite bird of the Ishasha section, a bird I'd always wanted to see and photograph. We get them as a very rare vagrant in South Africa. There was a group of 7 of them in the Eastern Cape earlier this year, which people rushed off to see. And I was quite happy to have my photograph from Uganda with this bird posing beautifully on a branch in wonderful sunlight. Right, so we left Ishasha, and then we headed to what's called the Kazinga Channel. And it's a wonderful piece of water. I've drawn a nice stretched oval here, and it lies between, it's a piece of water that actually joins Lake George and Lake Edward, I think, not Lake Albert, Lake Edward. And I was just reading through some of our notes from the trip, and I read this wonderful thing that Steffi, our driver, told us. I wondered why Lake George and Lake Edward had kept their names, very obviously colonial names. And what Steffi told me is that Idi Amin changed the names. He called them, the one was Lake Amin, and the other one was Lake Mobutu. So that's obviously Mobutu Sese Seko. So 2 of Africa's probably cruelest dictators. He was happy to change the names to something more suited to honoring him and his fellow dictator. And then once he was overthrown, they actually decided to change the names back to the colonial names of Lake George and Lake Edward. So a little bit of interesting history. So it's a channel of water that joins these 2 enormous lakes. And you get into a section of the park, and then you come to this Mbwindi spot over here, which is the mouth of the entrance to Lake Edward. And you travel in a boat all the way along the channel underneath this bridge, and it exits into Lake George, and you have an amazing time seeing the most wonderful wildlife. And the interesting thing is that there are a lot of fishermen and villages where before the national park was proclaimed, these fishing villages existed, and once they proclaimed the park, I think there are 7 villages that use plots in the park to access the tilapia, and they couldn't move them, so they just live amongst the wild animals. And we saw hippos and buffalo and crocodiles sort of grazing amongst the villages. So it was quite an interesting sight. So this is what the cruise looks like. It's much like you'd expect if you were cruising on the Okavango River or the Zambezi. You get in these little boats, and they take you to all these wonderful wildlife sites. There's some buffalo and Jeannie enjoying one of the Nile bears. And then there's some wonderful birds, swamp flycatcher and the red-throated bee-eater, much like our white-fronted bee-eater. And then birds that we don't see that often in South Africa, the skull-billed tern, there were hundreds of them, and then obviously hundreds of African skimmers. And the African skimmers really are quite beautiful birds, and unfortunately I really didn't get a good picture of them skimming, but it's an amazing experience to have a flock of 500 African skimmers skimming right next to the boat. So we left Queen Elizabeth National Park, which was our sort of game reserve section of the trip, and we we headed further north to the two reserves called Kibale and Semliki. So for some reason, they pronounce the K's as a CH, so that's Kibale and Semliki. And we had one of our targets for that section of the trip were the chimpanzees. So I'll come to that in a second. So this is what it looks like. That's Semliki over there, and Kibale is this weirdly shaped long reserve. And the three sites that we visited that were important were the Kibale Forest and Primate Lodge, which lies essentially right in the middle of the reserve, and it's actually on a main road between Fort Portal and I think it accesses Bwindi further south. So that's the Primate Lodge where we stayed. And then we visited a place called Mabamba Swamp, which is a community area where you find a whole suite of amazing birds. And then we went to a place called Semliki National Park. There are some hot springs, and it's a totally different experience in Semliki. And you can see it lies right on the border of the DRC. Kibale sits at about 2,000 meters in altitude, maybe a little bit lower, maybe 1,800 meters in altitude. And Semliki, you descend a pass over here, and you come down into the national park, and you're more at about 600 meters altitude. And essentially, this forest section over here is part of the Congo Basin. So it's a completely different forest type to Kibale, and our main reason for going down there is there's a whole bunch of birds that I was hoping to see. There are 8 different hornbill species that occur in Semliki. In the end, we ended up seeing 4 of them, and just a wonderful wildlife experience, although the 6 hours we spent there should have been 4 days. So this is accessing Kibale. This is the main road that goes through the forest, and you can see these beautiful gallery forests, and then this was the entrance to Primate Forest. So the first thing we did when we got there was to do a chimp walk. And as much as the gorillas were the main reason for the trip, you cannot go to Uganda and not go and look for the chimps. So we took a walk with this young lady who was taking a gap year and was working in Uganda. And she had spent an hour and a half on the back of a border to get to Kibale in order to walk and see the chimps. So she was pretty dedicated. And she definitely did not read the clothing requirements. Jeannie, you can see fully in her khaki. She's even tucked her socks in so that she doesn't get bitten by the fire ants. So much better than this lady. And actually, she did get bitten by fire ants. So these are these beautiful fig trees, these strangler figs. And these are the trees that you look for when you're looking for the chimps. So there are no trackers that follow the chimps. You basically walk the forest and you listen for the screeching and screaming. And then you follow them to where you can hear them screeching and screaming. And ironically, it took us much longer to find the chimps than it did to find the gorillas. This fig tree where all these figs are on the ground where they normally feed, it was barren of chimps. And so we had to keep walking until we found them. This was Jeannie hiding in the bush, her khaki doing wonders. This is an animal which I'm embarrassed to say I only found out the name of through some very kind assistance from my good friend Cliff Dorse, who knows a lot more about mammals than I do. This is a Harvey's red duiker, and this animal was literally the animal we saw just before we saw the chimps. And interestingly, chimps are omnivorous. So about 10% of their diet is meat, and about 90%, well, the remaining 90% is fruit and probably insects and things like that. And a chimp would definitely eat one of these Harvey's red duikers. They are quite aggressive animals, and they're actually a lot bigger than you think. So we stumbled on the chimps eventually, and it was a totally different experience. The gorillas were a very serene, quiet, peaceful experience. They sit and they feed quietly on the leaves, whereas the chimps are vocal, they're active, they're aggressive. And what they do is, this particular male, this was the male of the group, and we found a group of about 20 animals. This male was making his presence known by running wide circles around us, I think almost telling us that we were in his spot and we better stay away from his females, and I was okay with that. So he was running around us, and what they do is, just going back to this photograph over here, this tree, these roots, as they go into the ground, they actually are quite thin, and they they almost make a sound like a drum. So the chimp would run around in a big wide circle, crashing through the bush, jump onto the tree around about here, and then as he came down, he would bang his arms and hands on these roots and make this drumming noise. And it was incredibly intimidating and a very much more sort of on-edge experience than were the gorillas. There were some chimps who were happily going about their business, and it's wonderful to watch these very human-like faces and hands, bearing in mind that chimps are 98% to DNA match with humans. Apparently gorillas are 97%. So the chimps are our closest hominid relative. And they sit and they pick insects out of the back of the younger ones. This is the young one over here. And you can see he's got a nice pink ear. And then as they age, they get these much darker gray ears. But it's such an amazing experience to be so close to these creatures that are really just so similar to us and have the same expressions and the same, I think, way of sitting and thinking. We don't do enough of that. We should probably learn a little bit from them and do the same. So that was an amazing experience, so different to the gorillas, but one that I really think that while you're there, you really should do it. It incidentally is a lot cheaper than doing the gorillas. So the gorillas is quite an expensive exercise, and the chimps is as well, but it's a much more affordable one. So then there was some more birds, and what would a forest in Uganda be without a great blue turaco? Then there's a western nicator, which is closely related to our eastern nicator. There's a wonderful snowy-crowned robin chat, and that's not just a badly cropped photo. It was just, I was quite close to this wonderful little bird, and I managed to chop off its tail. These snowy-crowned robin chats are wonderful songsters. They're very similar to our either chorister robin chats or our white-browed robin chats. But the best thing about where we were seeing this bird is that just in the gloom behind it, we saw a bird called a white-spotted flufftail, which is quite a wonderful bird to see, but far too secretive to have got a decent photo. All right, and then the other main thing I wanted to do at Kibale, and my apologies to those of you who have listened to another one of my talk, which included a little bit of this story. I wanted to see one particular bird. It's considered to be, along with African green broadbill, it's considered to be, I would think, in the top 5 birds in Africa to see. It's incredibly rare, very hard to find, and you need to go with someone with local knowledge. And I made an arrangement to meet this wonderful young man, not that young anymore. He was retiring shortly after we were with him. His name is Jared, but they call him the pitter man. And the bird we were looking for was a bird called a green-breasted pitter. And what it meant is we had to meet at this visitor center. And when I say we, it was Fred and myself, because Jeannie was sleeping. We met him at 6 o'clock in the morning. It was pitch black. He did a quick briefing, told us to be careful of forest elephants. And he said we will walk to the display area of the green-breasted pitter. And these green-breasted pitters, what they do is they start displaying just before the morning sun hits the top leaves of the trees of the forest. So you need to be in position in the forest in the dark still. So we went into the forest. I had my cell phone torch. I hadn't intended to be doing any night birding. And I raced through the forest behind Jared while he was quietly ducking under branches and trees. He was about 4'9". Me at a little bit taller than that. I kept on hitting my heads on things, and I forgot to tuck my socks in. So I got drilled by lots of fire ants. But we stopped in the spot in the forest where the green-breasted pitters had been displaying a couple of days before. And we sat in the darkness. And the next thing that happened was there was this amazing chattering noise literally right next to us, which turned out to be a blue-breasted kingfisher, which was quite exciting for me because I'd never seen one before, but it gave us a hell of a fright. And then shortly thereafter, I heard a very, very distant display sound. It's a mechanical prup sound, which was the green-breasted pitter displaying. Jared then heard it, and he then hightailed it through the forest, not even on a path this time. And we basically clattered our way until we got to the spot where the pitter was displaying. And essentially you stand under the tree and you look up and you wait and see if you can see the white spots in its wing as it displays. So this was the bird sitting on the branch above our heads. This was actually a bird that we found a bit later. And it was a bit lighter because the first bird we saw, we had no chance of photographing because it was still dark. And they sit on these branches, and then every 30 seconds or so, they jump up off the branch and make that mechanical prip noise. It's definitely something that very few birders have had the privilege to see. It's not, having spoken to a lot of birders that have traveled in East Africa, green-breasted pitta is probably a 1 in 5 chance, even if you're there at the right time of year. So to be able to see this bird displaying like this, we watched for an hour, and it was just definitely one of the top parts of the trip. So then a few more bird picks, blue-throated roller, much like our broad-billed roller that we get in South Africa. In summer when they migrate, this one's got a slightly blue throat patch. Red-tailed bristlebill, which is actually one of the greenbuis. So not too much interest to me because they are so tough. And then we headed down for a morning to Semliki, and this was far hotter. It was down at about 600 meters altitude. And we had our Ugandan wildlife guys. This man on the left, I'm trying to remember his name. I can't remember his name, but he was absolutely phenomenal at imitating bird sounds. And he called up birds. He would listen, he would whistle as we walked along the forest path, just a full range of amazing bird song, and call things up just by whistling for them. So we did about a 12-kilometer hike in extreme 36 degrees humid temperature. So I'm getting a question coming through. All right, so it's a private question. Sorry, I just saw the chat room sparking there, so let me just go back to the presentation. And the main thing I wanted to see here were the hornbills, but we bumped into this far-crested alethi. The alethi that we get in Mozambique is a white-chested alethi, very, very hard to see, and this one was far more obliging. But we managed to see, these were 2 of the 8 hornbills. We only saw 4 of the 8, but this red-billed dwarf hornbill is a very tiny hornbill. For those that know yellow-billed hornbills, this thing's probably about half the size. And then the white-thighed hornbill is absolutely enormous. So it's probably double the size of a yellow-billed hornbill. And then a palm nut vulture, which many of you may be familiar with, and this wonderful African piculate. It's an absolutely awful photograph, but it's a bird of the Congo Basin. And without having gone to Semliki, we would have had absolutely no chance to see it. So piculate is a woodpecker. It's a type of woodpecker, these very short-tailed, very diminutive woodpeckers. In South America, in the near tropics, there are many, many species of piculates. There are probably 20 to 30 species of piculates. In Africa, we have 1, and that's African piculate, not surprisingly. And this particular bird was something that got our guides very excited. So I felt very, very privileged to have seen it. And then we're getting close to the end of the trip, and I'm sorry I'm taking so much time. I don't think I'm doing too badly, but we had one more bird we wanted to see, and I'm not going to keep you in suspense. It happened to be, in addition to this being an anniversary trip, this particular day when we went to the Mabamba Swamp was my birthday. So my one birthday present was, Jeannie said to me that I can take Fred with me for the entire trip. He was only supposed to be with us for 3 or 4 days in Bwindi, but she said, as a birthday present, you can take Fred along with you. So who gets to take a bird guide on an anniversary trip aside from me? So Jeannie, I really do appreciate it. I hope you're listening. So anyway, it was my birthday, and we woke up in Kibale, had an early breakfast, and then we had a long drive back towards Entebbe, and we could definitely smell the end of the trip. But we had one stop to do, which was at Mabamba Swamp, and the shoebill was our target. And as you can see, we found one. It wasn't quite what I'd envisaged. I had always dreamed of paddling along these swamps, and you can see more or less where we were. So Entebbe is right here, and this is the Mabamba Swamp, and it takes probably an hour to travel by car from Entebbe to Mabamba. So we approached it from the west. We'd obviously come from Fort Portal, traveled along this A109, and we came down to the Mabamba Swamps and then back around to Entebbe. And we had intended to get there, but by the time we got there, it was midday, and it was baking hot, and the light was very, very glaring, and we battled to find the shoebill. And when we eventually did, it was always so far away, and our poor poleman had to drag the canoe, this wooden canoe, into the swamp in order to get us closer to the shoebill, which we never really did. So that's him. trying to beat a path. The Shubal was somewhere in the background over there, and he didn't succeed as much as we had hoped. So my photos remain something to be improved upon when Jeannie next lets me go to Uganda, which I suspect maybe with my birding kids. And then these wonderful fruits. So instead of worrying about Shubals, Jeannie was tasting the wonderful pineapples that we bought on the side of the swamp. So we had a wonderful bird guide, but obviously most of these boats are used for either transport or for tilapia fishing. This guide over here, also can't remember his name, but he's based here, and he knows all the birds, and you take him along with you, and he knows where to find the Shubal, and he's your best chance at getting it. So there's the bird. It's a quite phenomenal bird. It's monotypic, which means that it's the only species within its family. So there are about 230 bird families worldwide, give or take a few, depending on which list you subscribe to. And of the 230 families, there are a number of bird families that have only one species in them. And the Shubal is one of those birds that it's the only species within its family. So it's incredibly special to see it. It's quite a remarkable bird. It's probably the size of, for those that don't know, it probably stands about 1.5 meters tall. So it's enormous. And it uses this Shubal to catch mostly barbel. So that's its main food source. And it basically lunges onto the barbel that are swimming in the choked waters of the swamps. It's quite a fantastic bird. And I guess my expectation of being nice and close to it and getting wonderful photos was not fulfilled, but still a bird that I'm so delighted that I'd seen. And then a couple of the other birds that are slightly more common. And then I just wanted to finish off this evening. I've been going for just on an hour. And I just wanted to finish off by showing a few of the primates of Uganda. So Uganda is known for its gorillas and chimps, but there are probably 28 species of primate, and Western Uganda has about 15. And we were lucky enough to see 11, 10 of which are photographed. So these are just the photos. Obviously, the top of the pyramid is the mountain gorilla, and that was the #1 priority. And we've seen a whole bunch of pics of the mountain gorilla. The chimpanzee, I think it's called an eastern chimpanzee, is #2 in the pile, and they just are wonderful creatures to see. Then the olive baboon, it's slightly different to our chakma baboon, but it's an animal of the savannah. And then most of these monkeys that I'm going to show you are primarily forest animals. This is Lahust's monkey, also not a great photograph, chopping off its tail. But these are like our vervet monkeys. They're very common and very cheeky, and they will steal food left out of your bungalow. They were very plentiful in Buhoma at the Gorilla Forest Lodge. And then this wonderful blue monkey, just such an amazing face. They look like chubby cheeks, but it's those furry cheeks. This is a monkey we saw on the way back from Ruhija. And this, I think, was the most attractive of the small monkeys. Unfortunately, this was the best shot I could get. It was stuck in a very dense part of the forest. This is a red-tailed monkey, quite a small animal, with a beautiful long red tail and this wonderful little dab of white paint on the tip of its nose. So a very cute little thing. And then these colobus monkeys. There are 3 species of colobus monkey that we saw. And in discussions with all the guides, they're renowned to be the stupidest of all the primates. So they actually are a food source for chimpanzees. So the chimpanzees kill and eat colobus monkeys. So whenever there are chimps around, these colobus monkeys go absolutely berserk. Here's the Ugandan red colobus monkey, which we saw at Kibale, Bwindi Swamp. And then this is the very range-restricted Semliki red colobus monkey, which used to be considered the same species, but they've split them now. And this is restricted to the Congo Basin. And then this very unusual looking, it almost looks like I don't quite know, it looks like a creature that you'd see at a Halloween party, these grey-cheeked mangabees, which were pretty common around the Bwindi Swamp. And that's the primates of Uganda. And with that, I come to the end of the talk. This was our very last afternoon in Uganda. We had a nice, relaxing time after spending time at Mabamba Swamp with a shubel. Excuse the facial hair, but it was a phase I was going through. And Jeannie and I took an 8-kilometer run around the streets of Entebbe down to the lake shore and enjoyed an ice cold beer. And then we said we cannot leave Uganda without experiencing a border. So we jumped on the back of this border and we raced through the streets of Entebbe back to our guest lodge. And it was a wonderful way to finish an incredible 11 or 12 day trip in one of the most beautiful countries you could ever wish to visit.